I'd like to call the meeting of the Public Accounts Committee to order. Today we have a presentation from the Auditor General on his report. Before we start, I'd like to remind everybody in attendance to put your phones on vibrate or silence. And we'll start with introduction to committee matters, starting with Ms. LeBlanc.
Good morning, Susan LeBlanc, MLA for Dartmouth North.
Good morning, Lisa Roberts, MLA for Halifax Needham.
Good morning, Tim Hallman, MLA for Dartmouth East.
Gordon Wilson, MLA for Clare Digby.
Good morning, MLA Suzanne Lonis-Croft, Lunenburg.
Good morning, folks. I'm Ben Jessam, and I represent Hammonds Plains, Lucasville.
Good morning, everyone. Brendan McGuire, Halifax Atlantic.
Good morning, Hugh McKay, MLA for Chester, St. Margaret's.
Thank you very much. As we said, on today's agenda, we have officials from the Office of the Auditor General with us to discuss the January 2019 report of the Auditor General. If we would, I'd let you guys introduce yourself.
Good morning, Michael Pickup, Auditor General.
Janet White, Audible.
Good morning, Amanda Atherton, Assistant Auditor General.
Thank you very much. If we would have some opening remarks before we have some questioning. Mr. Pickup.
Good morning, and thank you folks for the opportunity. To begin, I want to say thanks to the people of my office for this week, the Department of Internal Services for their professional dealings, and my colleagues at the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner, whom we worked with together. Yesterday morning, I tabled my special performance audit report to the Legislature on the 2018 privacy breach of the Freedom of Information Access website that resulted in the inappropriate disclosure of personal information. A few hours later, the Information and Privacy Commissioner and I co-hosted a media conference to communicate our findings and recommendations regarding this matter directly to the people of Nova Scotia via the media. From our work, we determined that the significant and damaging and still somewhat uncontained breach was wholly preventable. It is worth reminding ourselves this is not an abstract technical glitch without consequences. This is a serious matter with real human impacts. One example of the trauma that persists for some Nova Scotians includes the mother, whose unfortunate and difficult family situation and specific details identifying the child's name and school who were part of this avoidable breach. This is all very disturbing and far too real. In my report, I have made 5 recommendations that I believe will help repair some of what is broken at the Department of Internal Services. But the repairs will only work if the people carry through and make their promised changes as outlined, and that they fully address the matters. So my purpose here this morning is to answer your questions, to help you understand my report's findings and recommendations within the mandate outlined in the Auditor General Act. Specifically, I am here to work with you to help equip you in your role as representatives of the people of Nova Scotia as you probe and hold leaders and decision makers to account at the Department of Internal Services for this utterly preventable disaster. I believe the people of Nova Scotia now look for signals, actions, and assurances, both now and in the future, that when it comes to information and privacy protection, the right fixes are being made by the right people, and those fixes are sustainable and being monitored. We will now be more than happy to take your questions this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup. We will now open the floor to questions, beginning with the PC Caucus and Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Pickup, I want to thank you for your opening remarks. Your statement that the events that have transpired are not without consequences, I want to thank you for that. As we delve into your report, I hope we all can remember that we are talking about actions that have occurred, events that have transpired that impact Nova Scotians, that impact everyday people who are just trying to go about their business. It was a very interesting report. You know, I've certainly followed this case very, very closely over the past year. I think we would all agree that one of the fundamental roles of government is to ensure the safety and security of its citizens and its residents. Certainly in the digital age, that certainly applies to securing our data, securing our information. The Minister of Internal Services has indicated that she takes privacy very seriously. In your report, did your audit find anything that supports that statement? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Pickup.
So I think it works best for me when I talk to specifics. So specifically, I can talk about what worked and what didn't work well. So ultimately, without using up too much of your time, I think we certainly have indicated that risk management did not work well. This project was assessed at low risk when all indicators, without using hindsight, when all indicators would suggest that this was greater than low risk, and that project management was inadequate. So I think to stick to the specifics of the case for me, it was those two key areas of shortcomings that resulted in this.
Mr. Holman.
Specifically, did your audit report find anything to support the statement by the Minister that the Department takes privacy very seriously?
Mr. Pickup.
So if I look to actions, for example, and I will use this, it will sound like an odd example when I start the answer, but I would say that, you know, the proof in the pudding that the assessment of this was low risk after the breach was demonstrated by the fact that when the department then acted to do a security assessment, they found over 20 other vulnerabilities, up to 7 of which were critical. So I use that as what might seem like an odd example, but I use it twofold. One, to demonstrate that clearly a risk assessment should have been done, and two, to also show that once they became aware of this, they took that action. That didn't come after the audit, that occurred at the time. So it's a twofold example.
Mr. Hallman.
So am I correct in saying that if privacy was taken seriously, a risk assessment, proper risk assessment would have been in place? Is that correct?
Mr. Pickup.
So I believe that the expectation of a risk assessment and good project management is not an unreasonable expectation. It is, you know, the types of things we're talking about, like doing security assessments, are standard operating procedures, are the basics. These are not far-fetched ideas. These are not best practices that you might do somewhere in the private sector in another country. These are the standards and the expectations that government should be held accountable for.
Mr. Hallman.
Could you tell us what specifically were the obstacles to a proper risk assessment? Because if privacy is taken seriously, then I think for Nova Scotians it's fair to say that, you know, steps would have been taken, put in place to ensure a proper risk assessment if privacy is taken seriously. What steps should have been in place to ensure a proper risk assessment?
Mr. Pickup.
Sure. So, and I think it goes in tandem with what you said. It's not only ensuring a proper risk assessment, security assessment, vulnerability assessments get done, but it's also taking the time to really assess the risk well from the beginning. So, you know, when we look at this and we see Nova Scotia was the first jurisdiction in the world to implement the two of these things together, and we look at the 5 or 6 other key things that were happening at the time, all indications were that this was something greater than low risk. So the mistake from the beginning was to call this low risk and place undue reliance on the vendor and not do the appropriate procedures right from the get-go. Everything that happened after that all relates back to some of those initial decisions that, you know, frankly, were in error.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you're aware, in 2016, the report highlighted a number of concerns that we saw play out in this failure in privacy. In my mind, Mr. Pickup, if an individual in a position of leadership takes an issue seriously, they're going to take steps to ensure, as you say, that there's a proper risk assessment. Did your investigation, did your audit indicate or suggest that the department was taking those 2016 recommendations seriously? Was there any evidence of an action plan to remedy this, as was outlined in 2016? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Pickup.
Sure. So I'm working to try and keep my answer shorter to not use up your time. So if I need to expand, just encourage me to expand upon the answer. So the typical approach for us on following up previous audits, in this case 2016 Amanda that is referred to, we give the government 2 years to deal with the recommendations, and then we come back and on every audit, on every recommendation, and do what we call follow-up, which is a look-see to see what did you do with it. So the Amanda audit from 2016, we will be reporting in March of this year whether those recommendations were implemented. Now, you know, last night I was flipping through sort of some of my own summaries and things to see if the Amanda audit from 2016 had been called into public accounts committee at the time, and whether there was an action plan or follow-up or things suggested. But when I was flipping through my notes, from what I saw, the Amanda audit had not been called into public accounts committee, so I don't think an action plan had been filed.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yesterday, as you're aware, the Privacy Commissioner indicated and spoke of the concern that when privacy issues were brought up at the department, they were laughed at. And, well, I find that quite alarming, especially in the context that this has been presented where privacy is being taken seriously. A behavior such as that, one can conclude that no, that's not the case, that if some key people in the department, there's a culture where people are kind of scoffing at that or laughing at that, that is very problematic and troubling. I'm curious, Mr. Pickup, in your audit, in your investigation, did your investigation uncover similar instances where you know, the notion of privacy concerns being laughed at? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Pickup.
So we did some of the work together with the Privacy Commissioner. So some of the interviews would have happened together, and you know, the nature of her work is a little bit different than ours in terms of what her investigation included. So you know, in fairness to her and to the committee, I won't go into her report in terms of what she concluded upon, but I will say we did some of the work together. But our audit is more focused on the criteria and looking at the criteria, answering the questions, and you know, sort of less about those types of comments. But so I think I'll probably would leave it at that.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You've indicated that together with the Privacy Commissioner, you conducted some interviews together. Am I correct in saying that?
Mr. Pickup.
Yes, and if you want, I'm just looking to Ms. White if we can give you more details of, if you want.
With respect to that, was there collaboration between the Privacy Commissioner and the Office of the Auditor General to construct interview questions together, for example? Was there collaboration on that level? Since we have a common person that we're interviewing, perhaps we'll meet in advance to construct some questions.
Ms. White.
So the interviews actually took place quite early in our process. We hadn't developed our plan and what we were going to look at. It was really sort of digging up just what was going on and what was out there. We did collaborate on the technical aspects of the questions because that was what we were bringing to the table. The Auditor General's office was bringing that sort of technical piece. So we had our IT professional word the technical questions, if you will.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Privacy Commissioner indicated yesterday that she is very worried that the necessary changes that are required to ensure the safe storage of Nova Scotians' private information, she's concerned that the necessary changes won't be made. And I can only conclude from that statement it is because that those responsible for this breach are those responsible now to carry out these fundamental changes. Do you have concerns about that? Do you share the same concerns or level of worry as the Privacy Commissioner with respect to implementing changes within the department?
Mr. Pickup.
I'm going to directly answer that, but firstly I would say that any of these audits that we do, I'm absolutely concerned and interested, both as an Auditor General and as a Nova Scotian, that things get done. I mean, the whole point of doing these audits is not just to come up with the conclusions and the recommendations, it's to see that change occurs and that things are being implemented. So I'm always concerned on every one of these audits that things get done. Now, having said that, on this audit, of course, given the nature of it with privacy, you know, I'm very concerned and interested to see that things get done. I would remind folks that, you know, we do these audits and we report to the legislature, and this is a tool for all MLAs to hold the government accountable for making these changes. So I do hope this is one that the members of the legislature will continue to monitor to look to the government to say what is happening. You know, we didn't frankly see a lot of that on the Amanda audit when we did that audit, really, where there was not a lot of follow-up to see what happened with those recommendations. So I hope on this one it will be different, and I say that both as the Auditor General and as a Nova Scotian who's equally concerned about my privacy as well.
Mr. Holman.
Mr. Pickup, I want to thank you for your encouragement with respect to opposition asking tough questions. I mean, that is a fundamental ingredient in a healthy, dynamic democracy where opposition has the opportunity, opposition has the proper format to be able to ask tough questions of government. So I want to thank you for that encouragement. I know my colleagues in the opposition, in the official opposition, and in the NDP Caucus will certainly appreciate that. In your report, you speak to the project sponsor, but you do not name that person or indicate their role. The Privacy Commissioner has indicated that the sponsor was the Chief Information and Access Privacy Officer. Can you confirm that this is who you understand to be the project sponsor?
Ms. White.
Yes, that was the project sponsor.
Okay. Mr. Holman.
May I ask why in your report you didn't indicate that?
Ms. White.
Typically, in the way that we write our reports, we don't identify specific individuals or positions. So
Mr. Holman.
It's interesting. I mean, I think fundamentally, what Nova Scotians want to know is, you know, where does the buck stop, right? Who is accountable? This is arguably the biggest privacy breach in the history of our province. And we can ask questions about process, which is critical, but fundamentally we want to know all, I think Nova Scotians want to know all the key players. And that to me, I think is so key in knowing where the buck stops. So definitely, I see an issue with that in the report. I think, you know, while we, you know, your report definitely investigates and looks at the causes, I think we also need to keep in mind moving forward that, you know, there has to be a level of accountability. Certainly, you know, the spirit of your report, you know, talks about, you know, standard operating procedures, talks about, you know, it's just standard operating procedure that we have service expectations, that in contracts individuals know the financial obligations. Here's my question. Who should be held accountable for this lack of oversight? Because fundamentally that's what this is about, a lack of oversight, someone or some people not doing their job. Who should be held accountable for this lack of oversight?
Mr. Pickup.
So just I guess to go back to some extent and to expand upon it if you wish, and to my answer to a previous question. So we do these reports, you know, in accordance with the Auditor General Act, and we say, okay, here are the findings, and we report to the legislature. And then really, to me, this is a tool for the members of the legislature then to look to government, to hold government accountable for past results, what has happened, and then for fixing things going forward and to improving better government. What those questions mean in terms of accountability and what members of the legislature do with that report really is up to members of the legislature, right? It's similarly with the recommendations we make. It's not up to the Auditor General to implement those recommendations. It really is up to the government to look to make those, to implement those, and for members in the legislature to hold the government accountable as they see fit. In terms of answering who is accountable, you know, under our system, of course, I mean, it is the minister who leads the department, and we deal with the minister, we deal with the deputy minister as the, you know, the key person running the department day to day. But ultimately, I think our system of government is clear in terms of accountability. So again, often I know these answers can be long, and I'm trying not to totally use up your time. So maybe I'll keep it at that, and if you want more, you can encourage me to expand.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You've indicated that it is the minister that is ultimately responsible. We know that the minister has indicated to this House that she takes privacy very seriously. Does your interpretation of your report, does it does the minister's remarks match up with the evidence that is in your report? Everything you've outlined, do you believe privacy was not taken seriously?
Mr. Pickup.
So I think I'm going to give a threefold answer to that. I think one, we cannot excuse the results and explain away the results or take away the results of this audit. Clearly what should have been done to a reasonable expectation was not done. So there is no changing that fact that those things were not done. Second, the second part of my answer would be the response to the recommendations. Okay, so there were favorable responses to the recommendations. There's indicators of actions that are going to be taken. You know, small concern or I guess, advice / hope, whatever the right verb or noun would be there, is that a lot of those responses to the recommendations in our report don't have timelines. So I hope members of the legislature will hold the department to timelines to fix these things so that they don't go on for years. And third, I think, you know, in my dealings, I can speak with my dealings with the department. You know, certainly I would be more troubled. I'm troubled by what happened and the findings. There's no changing that. But in terms of my sit down and discussions with the senior folks running the department, they weren't spending their time arguing with me over whether these things are serious and whether they happened. The focus was on fixing things. But again, those are words until things get done. So I'm hopeful. But hope only goes so far, and now we have to see things get fixed.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your opening remarks, you indicated that this was an inappropriate disclosure of privacy information. The Privacy Commissioner has indicated that she sees this as an illegal disclosure of privacy information. Do you believe what's happened in this breach was illegal, was a violation of FOIPOP?
Mr. Pickup.
So our audit objectives didn't include looking at the legality, compliance, non-compliance with the Privacy Act. That was part of why we did this work in tandem. Those were her areas to look at. So I think in keeping with my earlier comment, I think in fairness to her and in fairness to the committee, I'm not going to speak to her conclusions in her report for the risk of not contexting something correctly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pickup. That concludes the time for the PC Caucus. We'll now move to the NDP Caucus and Ms. Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup and Ms. White, and for your work on this audit. Just to follow up on your last answer, Mr. Pickup, do you feel that this committee would be better served, and that I guess Nova Scotians would be better served if, in fact, the Privacy Commissioner would have been able to join us at Public Accounts today?
Mr. Pickup.
So I am here, of course, to speak to our report, and I think issues, in fairness to the committee and in fairness to me, issues of who the committee brings before it is really the business of the committee, and not for me to weigh in on.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup. Yesterday, in her comments following the release of the two reports, the minister characterized this situation as complex, and yet this audit characterizes these issues as a lack of very basic oversight and management. Can I ask for your comment on that contradiction, which I am seeing as I look at the report, at the reports and at the response? Do you think that the problem in this case was one of complexity, or is this something that the department should have been capable of?
Mr. Pickup.
So so my answer will be, in fairness to others, not to comment on anything anybody else said. I don't know the context of it, and I don't, fully know the discussion around it. And I think it's more appropriate if I stick to what I believe are well-founded audit conclusions. Now, to answer your questions, these were basic things we were looking at. So the failure to do some of the risk assessment type work, security assessments, threat assessments, the idea of doing those was not a far-reaching standard to hold somebody to. Is the world of IT complex? Yes. Remembering passwords on 18,000 devices that we all have and changing them every month can be complex. But the concept of doing security assessments, risk assessments, the concept that something might be higher risk because we're the first people in the world to implement it, to me is not complex. Those are fairly basic. And I think, you know, if I look at this report and the discussion around it and the summary page, and much to the credit of the team that I have and the hardworking folks in the office, I think if you know, reading these things, you don't need an IT degree, I believe, to understand the things that we're talking about that ought to have been done as basics. So I will hold to that rather than to commenting on specifics of what somebody may have said.
Ms. Roberts.
Well, I guess it jumped out at me as well in the additional comments from the Department of Internal Services that are included, in fact, in your audit report on page 17. It says what was learned in April 2018 is that despite the best of intentions, this site was the source of the unauthorized disclosure of information belonging to hundreds of Nova Scotians. This was not due to a single decision or oversight failure by the government, but rather a series of decisions, governance issues, and design shortfalls within a complex IT environment. You know, reading that, I feel like there's an element of excusing away the lack of appropriate action and oversight. I don't know if you'd want to comment on that at all.
My first comment, just for context, on the context, in those responses, I'm going to be, you know, fairly easygoing here to say we pretty much let the departments write what they want to in terms of the additional comments. This is a chance for them to write their comments. So we don't audit this. We don't do a lot of back and forth. If there was something here that was obviously, you know, ridiculous, we would have a discussion to say, you know, you sure you want to say that? I'm not too comfortable with that. But other than that, this is a chance for them to put something there. This is a chance for a discussion. You know, if the committee chooses to call the department in and have a discussion with them, you know, on that, it may be, you know, it may be worthy. And I said I wasn't going to comment on the Privacy Commissioner's report, and I'm not going to, other than to remind you of something that she put in there in terms of some of the quotes from some of the people in the department. One of which was a person who said I would do the same thing over again. So that may be a discussion, you know, if the committee chooses to call in the department, to have with the senior folks to come in to ask, you know, something like why would somebody say they would do the same thing over again if the lessons have been learned.
Ms. Roberts.
Indeed. So accepting that this was a lack of basic oversight, does the skill set, and assuming, I'm sorry, that the skill set, you know, required to do adequate oversight does exist within internal services, since it is, you know, the department of our government that is charged to have this expertise, what prevented that skill set from being deployed for this project?
Mr. Pickup.
So I believe, you know, to really narrow it down to the ultimate failure at the beginning was assessing this thing as low risk. It all fell apart from there. So when you assess something as low risk and you place undue reliance on outside vendors and then not doing those risk assessments, the security and vulnerability and threat assessments that ought to have been done, you missed the boat right away because you did that. So I think the question that I can't answer, that the question to the department would be, if somebody wants to pose it to them, is, you know, how could you have possibly thought this was low risk, given all of these things that that existed? And then again, you know, I go back to it, I guess, but to me, the proof of the pudding is that when this breach happened, and then they said, okay, let's do this security assessment thing now, and then to come up with 20 plus vulnerabilities, you know, half a dozen or 7 of which were critical, right, that could have been identified if you did this at the beginning. So I don't think it's a question necessarily of the skill set not being there. It's the same thing with the Architectural Review Board. You had the skill set there, you had the experts, you had the people, you had this board that said you have a 6-month approval as a pilot, come back to us in 6 months, and then you don't go back and tap into those folks and use them. There's where the mistakes, I think, ultimately occurred at the beginning, and it all went downhill from there.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. So if I can tap, the expertise of your office a little bit more to understand, how does a decision get made to determine that a particular project is low risk without doing a threat assessment? I mean, to arrive at that decision, you would think that you would look at the threat. So explain that.
Sure. Okay. So the initial risk assessment would be overall project. So is this low risk? Is this what risk level is this overall project? So we might call it the inherent risk. So this is where you would look at things like, oh, we're the first ones in the world to do this. That might suggest overall risk being higher. Therefore, we're going to do more detailed work, like a more detailed risk assessment, security assessment, penetration testing, all of these things. So it's that initial overall sense of how risky is this. So we gave 4 or 5 indicators to say, first in the world to do this, the department going through organizational change, a number of things suggested that overall the risk was greater than low. And then you move into doing things like vulnerability assessments, security assessments as well.
So in the course of the work of your audit, how can you characterize the conversation that was had that reached the conclusion that this was in fact a low risk project for the department?
Mr. Pickup.
Sure. So I guess it would be to some extent, the omission of a full consideration of the potential impacts of something, like being the first in the world. And why is being the first in the world important? I think being the first in the world to do something is important because you don't have case history. You can't say, well, 35 jurisdictions implemented this, 34 of those cases, there were no issues. 1 case, there were 5 issues. We know going into it, high likelihood, not many issues. So there was the omission of the full consideration of the risks around being the first jurisdiction. And it's not just, as I said, simply about being the first. It's what that gives you and does to you by being the first is not being able to look at other examples. So it's the omission of fully considering those types of things. It's things like, the reliance placed on the outside vendors without a full consideration of that as well. So it really is about sitting down and looking at the risks from the beginning.
Speaking to the relationship with the outside vendor, I'm just going to read a quote from the audit report. The private sector is largely driven by their own goals, and government must maintain responsibility for the public interest. That seems, like a very basic statement of a fact. It's certainly how I understand our work here as legislators, as members of the Nova Scotia government. It is to work for the public interest. But it seems that in this case, not only did internal services outsource, development of a website, but it also outsourced protection of our privacy. And we saw the results of that. Can you speak to the relationship with the vendor? How long had this vendor been working with? I guess this department was new, and yet it seemed that the relationship was long and established.
Ms. White.
So the relationship with this particular vendor had been going on for about 20 years at least. There's various versions of Amanda in play at government, which is what this vendor was providing, and in various departments. So it started in Service Nova Scotia. It also extends into Department of Community Services. So the relationship is not just with internal services. And as internal services was being created, it established an even deeper relationship as those people and those applications were starting to come into that sort of centralized department.
Ms. Roberts.
And as I understand, the total budget for this project that went so off the rails, like the annual expenditure on this would have been in the range of $65,000. How much would the government spend on, on the whole Amanda suite of servicing in a year? Is it partly the dollar value of this element of the work, the relatively small dollar value that maybe led to that assessment that, well, it's only $60,000 on top of however much. Maybe was that why it was deemed low risk?
Ms. White.
That was not mentioned to me during the process, whether the dollar amount had any impact on how it was determined to be low risk.
Ms. Roberts. Mr. Pickup, sorry.
Two quick things, and I'm trying not to use up your time. Yep. I'll remind you on paragraph 32 and recommendation 5 on these whole contracts, and it was when the team brought this to me to say that there weren't contracts in place with service expectations and financial obligations. I'll be honest, I said, haven't we done enough audits with that being an issue? That people across government have learned, put contracts in place, have service expectations there. I mean, that is not what I would call a far-reaching concept. The other point I was going to make is I did bring with me Chapter 3, which was the Amanda audit from 2016, and Amanda was implemented in 1999, and at that point in 2016, when we reported, it had cost over $50 million to date, with about $4 million annually in spend.
Thank you.
Ms. Roberts.
The Architectural Review Board, I don't entirely understand who convenes it, who chairs it, who would sort of trigger it being called into service to review a project like this.
Ms. White.
So the Architecture Review Board is made up of various members from throughout government. So there is somebody from privacy on there. There's somebody from infrastructure, cybersecurity. So there's different players that convene. I'm not sure about the actual how often they meet and that kind of thing, but people submit projects. The projects are reviewed by the Architecture Review Board. More information is requested or not. Projects are approved or not through that process. Right now, from what I understand, they are going through a change in their terms of reference. So maybe the department could broaden on that for you.
Ms. Roberts, or Mr. Pickup, sorry.
One quick thing on that Architectural Review Board to me that I was kind of left shaking my head on is that it's not, sort of us that recommend it. You have this board. It's not us to put it in place. You have the group. You have the technical experts. You have sort of defined what they should do, that they're there. So when they gave you a 6-month, not you, but when they gave the department a 6-month pilot approval, that sent a message that, this thing should have been watched more closely. So I find that, frankly, a big miss.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Roberts.
Yes. Do we know from the scope of your audit, and I know that the Privacy Commissioner also spoke to this, but do we know the extent of the breaches? I mean, we've talked about it as a privacy breach that was discussed or discovered April 4th, 2018. But given that the FOIPOP public portal could have been, it was basically an open door with no key from January 2017 until April 2018. So is there any way of us knowing how many different breaches of personal information occurred during that time?
Ms. White.
No, there is no way to tell. They used the logs that were available to determine who downloaded what piece of information. However, there is a period of time where they do not have the logs for that. Some breaches may have occurred during that time.
Ms. Roberts.
Did you find any indication of a discussion at the level of the department about using a separate portal, or limiting the design of this portal to only have it used for public disclosures?
Ms. White.
Can you repeat that, please?
Was there any discussion of using this new public-facing portal only for public disclosures, the sort of disclosures that are triggered by access to information requests by journalists or by caucus offices, et cetera?
So that would have been a conversation that would have happened during their implementation process. We didn't look at that design aspect of it. We looked at how was it designed and what happened.
Okay. Thank you. I would like to understand a little bit more the threat risk assessments. I understand the first in the world, that's a particular risk. What other elements would be considered in a threat risk assessment?
Ms. White.
The threat risk assessment would look at things like a security assessment is part of a threat risk assessment. Penetration testing, things in the environment, things from within the system. So you would hire someone to see if they could break in, crack in. So that would be part of the threat risk assessment overall.
And right now in government, given what you know about the various systems that exist on the Amanda, I guess now Amanda 7 platform, are there other systems that are vulnerable?
Ms. White.
We did not look at any other systems in terms of their vulnerability. This specific vulnerability was the one we looked at for this specific system. So.
Okay. Okay, thank you. What should Nova Scotians expect the government to do to ensure new contracts with vendors do more to protect their personal information?
Ms. White.
I think that the service expectations need to be laid out very clearly. They also need to make sure that they are staying current and up to date. Things are changing significantly and at a very quick rate. So the contracts have to change and be updated as well.
Ms. Roberts. Order, please. That concludes the time for the NDP Caucus. We'll now move to the Liberal Caucus and Mr. Maguire.
Good morning. So I'd like to start by saying that I think everybody on this committee, and I think all of government, recognizes and acknowledges how serious of a breach this was, and fully recognizes the role government has in this incident, and I guess are committed to making the change to better protect Nova Scotians. So a big thank you to the Auditor General and their office for this very comprehensive and important report. It seems to me that, you know, just kind of looking at the private sector and looking at government, that 2018 was the year of data breach. That seemed to be one of the big headlines in all the media, from some of the giant social media companies to companies like Under Armour and things like that, some of the weaknesses in their databases were exposed, and a lot of, in some cases, billions of pieces of information, public information or private information, was exposed. When a private company like Facebook, for example, is breached, there's a loss of public trust. There's an impact on their bottom line and their shareholders, and they usually react immediately to try to restore public trust. When it comes to governments, you know, on the private sector, you know, if I feel that my data is not fully protected in a company like Facebook, I can just stop using their product. Simple as that. When it comes to governments, the public doesn't have that luxury. They have to continue to use their services. So your recommendations were very specific on what needed to happen to prevent future data breaches and to protect the public's information. What was the reaction from internal services, from the employees of internal services, and from government? In your opinion, what was the reaction to those very important recommendations?
Mr. Pickup.
So I'm going to give my response based on my dealings and you know, with the senior folks in the department. And you know, one, I think it is important that, you know, there were some pretty serious findings in here. There was never an attempt to, one, you know, question whether the findings were wrong in terms of, unless there was a, you know, a back and forth on a technical issue, but there was no attempt to minimize these, no attempt to dismiss them, no attempt to say we got it wrong. You know, there was, I think, you know, what I respected was, I think, a sense that what we were doing here was going to add some value. That yes, the department was going to have some tough days, as they should, to answer as to why these things happened. But ultimately, I felt that the team and our office was being respected in terms of being able to bring something to the table to help prevent this, ultimately for the people of Nova Scotia, which is what we're all trying to do.
Mr. McGuire.
Absolutely. So do you feel that there is an action plan in place, or there is remedies from the department based on your recommendations? And will you be keeping a close eye on that for all of Nova Scotians to ensure that that data is protected, that it's secured properly, and that you know, these issues don't arise in the future? I mean, to me, obviously, this is a very unfortunate, and it is a, you know, it's something that should never have happened, but it's also a learning experience for everybody involved. That, you know, you talked about things like, I kept hearing you say like low risk threat, and I think what this will potentially do, your recommendations in your report should do, is open the eyes of everybody involved that any threat is a threat, and that when these recommendations come down and when these audits happen, that we need to react accordingly. So in your opinion, are they reacting accordingly? And if and when an action plan is put in place, will your office ensure and kind of give a little oversight to make sure that these are put in place?
Sure. So
a lot of questions there. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm keeping track of four. I think in my in my head. So the chair can steer me if I've missed any of them, because it wouldn't be intentional. It would. I certainly would come back to them. So one, the responses are concrete. I think I was going through the responses last night to our recommendations in this report. I'm not talking about any external action plan that was released. I won't comment on that. But in terms of the responses to our recommendations, I think last night going through them, I might have counted up 14 or so concrete things in the responses to the recommendations. I think I counted up probably 14 things. Okay, I hope members of the legislature will look to the department to say, okay, you responded to the Auditor General recommendations. We know he will be back in 2 years, but this is not stuff that can wait 2 years to make sure it's being fixed. So, you know, I hope that perhaps the committee will hold them accountable to say, okay, you gave these responses. Where are you on timelines of getting these things done? So I have to be encouraged that they favorably responded. I have to be encouraged that there are tangible things in there, and now I have to be hopeful that they are held accountable by the appropriate folks and by the legislature to do these changes. I believe that they want to. Now, in terms of the action plan, I haven't looked at the detailed action plan that they released. This is one. I mean, given the type of thing, I mean, this is a big deal for us. This is a big deal for everybody. You know, it's when the team brought this to me and this all became public, and as we were working through it, you know, this was very upsetting, I think, for all of us. So having having said that, you know, we're going to keep a closer eye on this. And to see how government is dealing with the recommendations, probably stay closer to it rather than just waiting the 2 years. I will probably be in contact with the senior folks in the department more often for regular updates, and we've had some of that discussion that we will probably do that, which is unusual. This is unusual, right? But this situation is unusual. So we are going to stay closer to the department and not just wait the 2 years, and then use this also as an example to keep us informed from a risk perspective, to see if there are other concerns we have that maybe we should be auditing something else along this as well. So I think I answered your 4 questions.
Yeah, you definitely did. So I mean, ultimately, to myself and most, if not all, Nova Scotians, this comes down to public trust. This comes down to maintaining the information, the private information that all Nova Scotians, when we access different portals on government websites, I think sometimes myself, I know you take for granted that your information is going to be safe and secure. If and when all of these recommendations are implemented, do you believe, in your professional opinion, that this will help restore the trust of Nova Scotians that their data will be safe and secure when dealing with government websites and government officials?
Mr. Pickup.
So I think satisfactorily implementing these recommendations and doing the actions committed to should go a long way to being more prudent in terms of managing these issues. And I think, as you alluded to, you know, doing anything today, you're never going to have 110% certainty that nothing is ever going to happen. But you have to take all the reasonable steps. So I think doing these things that we do recommend and that the department indicates are the actions forward should put the province in a more reasonable position to say, you know, we are managing privacy, we are managing this information in a more prudent way, which should give us more certainty than we had on the protection of information for people.
And I'll leave it with this, and then I'll pass it on to another member of the team. But I think as MLAs and as members of this committee, I think we all take this issue very serious, and we will all be keeping a very close eye on these recommendations, and I know government will be doing everything within their power to ensure that this doesn't happen again. So with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Jessom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, 2 quick points to start. As we're critical of this situation, I think that it's important that we acknowledge 2 things. Firstly, that we're dealing with the exposure of individuals' personal information. I don't think that should be lost. I know that's why we're here, but I think that it's important to acknowledge that. And secondly, and at the risk perhaps of being criticized for I don't mean to sound like I'm undermining the severity or trying to avoid acknowledgement of the severity of the situation, but we're also dealing with department officials whose livelihoods revolve around the work that they do. And yes, there were mistakes made, but I think that I just like to acknowledge the fact that they are invested in Nova Scotians as well. I will table for the benefit of the committee an April 20th document that the minister has signed, reaching out to solicit the services of the Auditor General's office, indicating, I guess, a further acknowledgement that there were mistakes made and an effort to attempt to rectify the situation. So in saying all that, I would like to focus on I guess the relationship or the I guess the commentary in the initial section here related to a lacking or a inadequate consultation with amount of consultation with the ARB. Can you comment on that statement? There was lacking consultation completed with the ARB.
Ms. White.
So at the time that this project was being implemented, the ARB had specific guidelines for the types of projects that it was to look at. So it would be things that touch the architecture of the government's network. So the pieces that touched the government network were what were submitted for that 6-month pilot project. Mm-hmm. The other parts did not have to be submitted to the Architecture Review Board at that time, so they were not.
Okay. I think thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. What I'm specifically trying to understand is that this is a group that has a mandate to oversee and approve these types of initiatives. And what I'm trying to understand is if there was a go-ahead given that was done either without a recommendation to do so, because right now I'm seeing that there was a recommendation to move forward produced by the ARB. So why wouldn't government move forward with that recommendation in place?
Ms. White.
So paragraphs 11 and 12 of the report basically lay out how the Architectural Review Board was part of this process. Mm-hmm. So yes, there was an approval for a 6-month pilot for a piece of this project, mm-hmm. not the entire project. Mm-hmm. The Architectural Review Board did not see the entire project, either from the original application side of things, mm-hmm. nor the portal. Mm-hmm.
Mr. Jessen.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Sorry, Mr. Pickup, sorry.
Sorry, I just want to add one more that I think is an important point is that, and we remind you of this in paragraph 12, that when the 6-month approval came for that part of it that Ms. White referred to, the ARB did require that it be resubmitted to that group for final approval, but the project went ahead without the final approval. So they got a 6-month approval for a piece, mm-hmm. bring it back, and before you get final approval, they didn't bring it back. So
I appreciate that. Yep.
Mr. Jessen.
Thank you. Can you comment on whether I guess what I'm trying to ask is, was the timeline to initiate these components expedited to an unreasonable point, or I guess my thoughts are, was there a timeline that people involved were required to meet that was unreasonable in terms of identifying the risks or mitigating risks, or was it just related to oversight period?
Ms. White.
If I could just go back to Mr. Pickup's last comment about the project that did not come back. So that particular piece of the project actually did not occur anyway, mm-hmm. but it still was not called back. No one knew what happened to that project. That piece was not implemented, just to be clear there. And can you repeat your last question?
I'm just curious if timeline had any impact on the oversights.
So the project, both projects, the overall thing, because it was a low-risk project from the beginning, as Mr. Pickup had indicated previously, the timelines were explained to us. No one seemed to have an issue with meeting those timelines, okay, because those other individual pieces were not intended to be done.
Okay.
Mr. Jessen.
Would you, I guess, if only one component that, as you've stated, didn't end up being implemented anyway, should all the components have funneled through the Architecture Review Board before initiation?
At the time that this project was going through, there was not a clear expectation of whether or not it should go through, so it did not, the whole project did not go through ARB.
Okay, I understand. And as your office has stated, there is, I guess, a review of the mandate of that group that's underway. Okay. I think that's, I know I've got a couple more minutes left, but I think Ms. Lonescroft is going to jump in here. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Ms. Lonescroft.
How much time?
4 minutes.
4
3
minutes.
minutes,
Okay.
sorry, 3.
Okay. You did say that when you went in, this was discovered in April, when you went in to do your audit, that the department had already started implementing some risk assessment. Can you tell us how far they had gone or what they were doing in that risk assessment?
Ms. White.
At the time that we were brought...
They had already determined the 20 risks, did they not, in the up to 7 critical ones? When you went into the department, was that already done? That was already done. So how far into that had they implemented?
So by the time that we had come in, they had already, the vendor as well as the department had already contracted out and had some results reported back to them on the vulnerabilities that were in the system.
Okay, so and so that's where they found the 7 highly critical ones?
Correct.
As well. Okay, so was that completed by the time you got in there? You were in there? That was done.
Correct.
So what had they started implementing when you came in for the audit?
At that time we knew that they had already plugged the vulnerability that had been the cause for the breach.
Okay.
And the system was already down.
And what was that plug?
It's coding.
It was all coding?
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't understand coding that well. Sorry.
In the process of putting in that plug, if you will, it broke the system in other parts, so they just could not bring it back live. So it was decided just to keep it
so that was what caused the delay in getting the site up and running. It's fixed.
Sure. Yes.
Oh, okay. Didn't understand that. Okay. When you went in there, who did you interview in the management of this? The vendor, of course, you would have interviewed?
No.
No?
No.
Just people from the department?
Correct.
Okay, so...
so we talked to the CIO, Chief Information Officer. We talked to the project sponsor. We interviewed members of the project team. We interviewed the project manager for the second half of the implementation. We did sit down with the Halifax Regional Police as well to get their feedback on the breach. Architecture Review Board members, we had discussions with them as well.
Order, please. That concludes the time for the Liberal Caucus. We'll move back now to the PC Caucus. And Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a point of clarification, how much?
We're going to do 14 minutes
14
each.
minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just going back within the context of taking ownership, accountability, nowhere in the response to the report is anyone or any group held responsible. Do you think that in order to move forward, do you think there has to be more specific accountability? I mean, fundamentally, that's what we're talking about here today, the best way to move forward to ensure the protection and privacy of Nova Scotians' personal information. Do you think there needs to be more specific accountability built into this process?
Mr. Pickup.
I was waiting for the light, waiting to see the light, and the light came on. So I think accountability, I mean, I have to respect my role and mandate here. So my job is to report to the legislature on the results of these audits, make clear conclusions, make key recommendations, and give members of the legislature the responses. Then in terms of what accountability means, in terms of you know, the discussion with the organizations, audited by members of the legislature, with monitoring to see what happens with these types of things, notwithstanding what we do on follow-up. Much of that, in terms of what happens in terms of accountability, is really up to the members of the legislature. So it's not really for me to say what I think MLA should do with this report. I do believe, though, that as Auditor General, I hope this will be a useful tool, obviously, to hold the government, the department to account, to say, okay, we're going to monitor, we're going to see that these things are being done, and we want to have a discussion, some of which has happened today, about how reasonable, how outraged, how concerned people are with those results. So it's not for me to answer some of those things, it's really for me to give you the tool and for you then to ask those questions and to hold the government accountable.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Certainly appreciating your role, the role that you see for the legislature, the role you see for this committee in our process. In following up on your recommendations, if a department or a minister were taking privacy seriously, in your opinion, would they wait to hear from the committee, hear from us, before actioning these recommendations? Something doesn't line up for me here. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. So I believe, based on my discussions, not only with the team, but also my discussions with the senior folks at the department, that action is underway. You know, people aren't sitting by waiting to come to a committee or to go to for members of the House to ask them questions. So I certainly would never want to leave the impression that folks didn't take this seriously within the department. But I think now, in terms of that accountability structure, I think, you know, answering to a group like elected officials gives that added accountability. But I believe that we do audits. People act upon the recommendations based on the responses they give. Firstly, because they believe it's the right thing to do. Secondly, I think a part of the accountability and the encouragement for organizations to act upon their recommendations is the accountability process, but I don't believe that is the one and only driving force. I believe that when public servants, when people respond to our recommendations as they do, I believe they wholeheartedly mean what they say, and they do see the need to change. So I do believe that. So to summarize, I guess, you know, I believe the department realizes how serious this is, and that they are now working on it, and now we all have to watch and hold them accountable to make the changes.
Mr. Holman.
Accountable is a theme we come back to time and time again, and most Nova Scotians in their jobs are certainly held accountable day in and day out. My understanding is that the minister's mandate letter states the following: internal services should continue to implement robust cybersecurity and privacy programs that protect Nova Scotians. Did the minister fulfill her mandate?
Mr. Pickup.
So I can talk to the audit findings, and I would say, did the Department of Internal Services, led by the minister, effectively risk manage and project manage these two projects? The answer was quite clear, no, and there's no disagreement or argument from the department with that finding, with that conclusion.
Mr. Holman.
My understanding is that there were two recommendations in that 2016 report. One is to better manage the Amanda contract and reassess terms before 2018. And the second was to assess value, the cost of the contract before the 2018 renewal. Again, was there any indication that these two recommendations, which had a 2018 deadline, any indication that those recommendations, that there was an action planned, that this was actioned? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Pickup.
Sure. So as part of our normal process, we follow up on all of the audit recommendations that we do so that we can answer the number one question I get asked on the street. What happens after you folks leave and what happens to the recommendations? The answer is 2 years later, we come back and we will tell you. So for the 2016 audits, we will be reporting in March of this year as to whether those recommendations have been implemented or not. Outside of that, we're really, I mean, given that we probably over a 2-year period have up to 20 audits that we're following up, in that short window, we are not following up. And I believed when I looked last night, I don't think the Amanda audit came to Public Accounts Committee, so there probably wasn't an action plan or a follow-up timeline given to the Public Accounts Committee as to what was happening.
Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to direct some questions with respect to the rushing of Access Pro. Certainly what I'm understanding is clear lack of oversight, clear lack of risk management. You've indicated that there was no government project manager for the Access Pro project, which is, I think, quite alarming. I think any project, you want to have that oversight. I mean, that's just, as you've indicated, these things are just standard operating procedure. And so it is quite alarming. In paragraph 11, you stated that components that did not impact the government network were not assessed by the Architecture Review Board, the ARB. Did your audit come across any other instances or applications where information is being housed outside the government network and therefore not assessed by the Architecture Review Board?
Ms. White.
That's not something that was part of our objective or criteria to look at for this particular audit.
Mr. Pickup, sorry.
Can I just add quickly, somewhat related but not to the ARB, is because this is something that will always stay with me, I think, from this audit as well, and that's in paragraph 7. So this was going to use cloud computing. The department developed a strategy in 2013 that included questions to ask around risks related to cloud computing, but those resources weren't used here, so those questions weren't asked. That really concerns me. I mean, cloud computing is a reality, right? And we're not suggesting that people shouldn't be using cloud computing. But when you have a strategy and you identify risks and questions, you want to make sure you use them. So that was another area that we haven't talked about, but I quickly wanted to get that point in there because it stays with me.
Mr. Hall.
So are you aware of any other instances or applications where information is being housed outside the government network and therefore not assessed by the ARB?
Ms. White?
I don't know the specific applications and information that's being housed out there, but there are, I'd rather not say. I'm not sure. Yes, the department should be able to tell you for sure.
Mr. Hallman.
Okay, there just seems to have been this absolute rush to push this website to get it up and running. I think we've established that due diligence was not followed. Certainly your report outlines that very methodically. Did your audit find any indication that there was a conscious effort within the Department of Internal Services to push this project forward regardless of the usual procedural obstacles?
Mr. Pickup.
So I mean, what we really focused on here is what should have been done, ought to have been done, reasonably expected to be done, so that even if somebody did give us that might be part of a story, which I'm not saying it was here, but it wouldn't be acceptable. I mean, these are things that you know, are a reasonable bar as to what should have been done and weren't.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Paragraph 16 refers to the fact that the Freedom of Information website wasn't submitted to the Architecture Review Board because it was, to quote from your report, a change, not a new application. You use the word currently to begin that statement. From that, can we infer that if this whole process were to start again today, it would still not be submitted to the ARB?
Ms. White?
That is correct.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, let's talk a little bit about oversight and the reliance on the vendor. Reading a lot about assessments, penetration tests, in a number of these points throughout your report, and how they could have possibly helped point out the inherent weaknesses in the projects and the obvious oversight and the carelessness. Clearly, there was no testing. There were signs while doing your audit report to suggest that at least someone had voiced that such a thing should be done. In your investigation, in your audit, did you come across that other perspective that, look, these things should have happened? Did anyone voice that to you?
Ms. White.
Throughout the process, there was areas where it wasn't clear whose responsibilities, what they're responsible for, and it stemmed from this reorganization of internal services.
Mr. Holm.
In sociology, that's known as diffusion of responsibility, and where no one is taking ownership, no one is stepping up and saying, I'm accountable. And it sort of comes back to that theme I've been talking about. I certainly appreciate the recommendations you've put forward, but it seems like there's that gap. Like who or what group was fundamentally responsible? Why didn't anyone in this situation step up and say, look, we should be doing these things? So am I correct in saying that there was no one that voiced to you in this investigation that, you know what, maybe we should have done X, Y, Z?
Ms. White.
The Chief Information Officer indicated to us that she has ultimate responsibility.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to the question that I asked regarding the mandate letter, I'd like to table that mandate letter. That's what I was going to ask.
If you quoted from a letter, which you table,
yep, and I have that here.
Okay, here's 45 seconds if you have a quick short snapper.
No, Mr. Chair, I think that concludes my questioning. Again, I have grave concerns that an ingredient is missing here with respect to accountability and taking ownership. Certainly action plans are important, but I also think that moving forward, we have to make sure that the right people are in place to ensure that these changes that Nova Scotians expect, the protection of their privacy, is utilized to its utmost. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Holman. We'll move now to the NDP Caucus and Ms. LeBlanc.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here. Mr. Pickup, I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the work that was done here, and in particular in your comments about giving a real-life picture to the implications of this situation and what you described as an utterly preventable disaster. I think that with a lot of things technical, possibly, or just generally in government, that we as everyday Nova Scotians sometimes don't understand the implication of a decision or a mistake until it actually affects us. And hearing these heartbreaking stories, in particular the one about the woman and her child's identity being revealed, I hope it gives all Nova Scotians pause to consider how government and the decisions made in government affect our daily lives. So I want to thank you in particular for highlighting that. And based on your comments, I'm wondering, how, if you can comment on your concern, or if you are concerned about the 600 missing documents that are still out there, and also given the fact that we don't know that if there were or could have been other breaches. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about that and the department's pace at which they are working to contain those missing documents and looking to see if there's a way to detect other breaches.
Mr. Pickup.
So the aspect of containment, which is a critical part of this as well, was not something that was part of our audit work. That was something that the Privacy Commissioner did as part of her work, and that she reported on yesterday. So in terms of what is happening with that, probably I will I will leave that to the department. You know, if they arrive here to, if you call them in as a witness, and let them explain to you what they are doing with containment, since it wasn't part of our direct audit work.
Ms. Roberts.
Oh.
Or Ms. LeBlanc, sorry.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you've mentioned before, and I understand that the sort of general practice for your office is to, after you do an audit, to check back 2 years later. Earlier in the session, you did say that you would be keeping a closer eye on sort of the department's implementation of your recommendations. And I'm wondering if you can just clarify that, and if you have a plan laid out to you know, alter your regular practice. Like, are you going to come back in 6 months, a year, or are you just, you know, do you have a sort of codified plan for that?
Sure. So our plan for that, you're right, is a little abnormal. It's a little unusual, and I think it recognizes that, you know, this audit includes such important information and the privacy of information in people's lives, that what I've agreed with the minister and the deputy minister is that we'll look for quarterly. We've agreed on getting quarterly updates as to what is happening with the recommendations, so that we have a sense of what is happening, both from the perspective of this audit, but also from the larger risk understanding in government, to say, is this uncovering, for example, other issues? Are there other audit areas that we should be considering? Are there issues preventing them from doing this more quickly, or doing this as quickly as they planned? So it's that kind of awareness. We're not intending, because we're 35 people and we have to watch, you know, what all we're doing. We're not intending to start doing quarterly public reporting on that. We're not going to do reporting to the House on that. This really is an agreement between sort of me and the minister and deputy minister to say, we all acknowledge that this is a really sensitive issue. We better stay close to it to give us this sense. But of course, that doesn't stop a committee from doing whatever they want in relation to following up with the department.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Thanks. I'll just ask one more question before I hand it back over to my colleague. I just wanted to ask about the finding that there was a lack of documentation. And your audit found that when the FOIA website was implemented, there was no amendment or change order or contract in place, or new contract, I should say, created. Can you explain how it is that a project would be able to move forward without a new contract in place?
Mr. Pickup.
Sure. So I will give the first part of that answer, and if my colleague, Ms. White, wants to add to it, that's fine. And if you want to even more detail, you can look to the department. But, you know, I think the easy answer is, or the quick answer is, there was this long-standing relationship there that already existed. I alluded to earlier, you know, how much money was being spent on this over the past. So I think that probably contributed to it, to say, okay, we already know these folks, therefore we'll get them to do it. I'll just double check to see if Ms. White wants to add anything to that.
Ms. White.
Just that they were in the process of doing a change request to incorporate the new pieces, but they couldn't agree to the terms, so it was never signed.
I just have a B part. And are you aware of any other instances where government has implemented a project without a contract or any definition of roles and responsibilities or financial obligations?
Mr. Pickup.
Do you mean in relation to this or in government-wide?
Government-wide.
So I'm going to say that is a big question, to one to which I cannot give an answer, because, you know, again, we would have to do audit work on specific areas to be able to really answer that. So I can't say yes, I can't say no.
Okay, thanks.
Ms. Roberts.
I do want to acknowledge that for many of us, though our lives involve using a lot of technology and also probably sharing some of our personal information online, many of us aren't aware of the specific safeguards that we are counting on various entities, both public and private, to put in place to make sure our information is safe. But there is a fundamental difference between a privacy breach at a Facebook or some large private sector entity and a privacy breach with the government of Nova Scotia, in that citizens are obliged to share their information with government. We're not obliged to share our information with those private sector companies. And I do think about the cases of child protection, for example, where, there isn't an element of choice where you're choosing to do a transaction. It is the job of government to, in some circumstances and in some extremely difficult and painful circumstances, to intervene in our lives, and that is why that information is there. So given that, what ought, I guess, the bar for risk and the test for risk be, and how ought that to be, I guess, different perhaps for the government of Nova Scotia versus for, a private sector entity that is working to safeguard, my credit card information, for example.
Mr. Pickup.
Without disagreeing with anything you said, because I wouldn't want to suggest that those factors contributed to us holding the government to a higher standard than a basic standard. I mean, so I think the things we're looking at would be basic, even if it was just transactional information. Now, recognizing that these were the privacy folks that we're talking about, these are the folks who should know about privacy, these are the folks that clearly knew what type of information they're dealing with, how they could have assessed this as low risk, is just very confusing to me to understand how that could be. And I think in looking back now, probably when all of this is laid out, they would agree.
Ms. Roberts.
I wonder, is there anything further that Ms. White would want to add in terms of what the bar should be? I mean, ought the bar to be, in fact, ought the test to be a more stringent test because of the nature of information that is held by government?
Ms. White. Mr. Pickup. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, we both want to say something. One, I think I will speak as a non-IT technical person, and then Ms. White can add her part. I think it's incumbent upon government to do the triage, if you will, of that, to say, okay, what is the impact if this type of information is disclosed? Right, so you do some sort of assessment to say, okay, this is health information, this is family information, probably high risk to an individual if this type of stuff gets exposed, versus something that might be lower risk. So as a non-technical person, I would say I would expect the people who are responsible for the privacy of this information to be able to do that and to say, okay, go through and triage. Now I'll turn to Ms. White to add.
There's really not a technical piece to that. I mean, the reality is it was private information that was being stored and potentially could be accessed. My comments were actually a mirror of Mr. Pickup's. So,
Ms. Roberts.
I wanted to go back to the Architectural Review Board because I believe I heard in a comment from Ms. White, reference to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner as participating on the Architecture Review Board. Can I confirm that? Is that correct?
Ms. White.
The member on the Architecture Review Board is from the division with Internal Services, not the Office of the Information Protection Officer.
Okay.
Commissioner.
Sorry.
Thank you. So I misheard. I wonder if you would comment on the suitability of, or I guess on whether it would be advisable for that committee to tap into the resources and I guess the particular sensibility of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. Would that be a good step moving forward as we seek to, I guess, regain real public confidence in the province's ability to safeguard our information?
Mr. Pickup.
So I think the point of part of the point of this ARB is the government needs to figure out what do they want them to do. All right, so it's not necessarily for us to say these are all the things they should do. Here's what this should encompass. It's up for them to figure out what all of this means and to do it, in an efficient and effective way as well. Without creating an overly cumbersome process. I won't talk about the privacy report, but I would indicate that in that report yesterday, the Privacy Commissioner did mention that she was consulted. In the days before and made some suggestions that were enacted upon.
Ms. Roberts.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I heard you. That were not acted upon. Right. Okay. In one of my lives before being an MLA, I was a journalist, and certainly as a journalist, was party to many conversations about the frustration of long delays and cumbersome processes for accessing government information. And of course, that was one of the functions of this public-facing portal of the FOIPOP website. It strikes me that the range of information that was accessible through that same portal with the same security, same lack of security, is really quite dramatic. We're talking about information that government is releasing to the public intentionally because it has been, deemed to be public information. And then we're talking about some of the most intimate, personal, possibly damaging information about private citizens. Did you come across any analysis, or can you offer any of your own analysis about whether it was even possible to do a risk assessment of that, I guess, piece of real internet architecture, given the range of information that was going to be accessed through it? Because it strikes me as like that really we ought to have been talking about two very different doorways.
Order, please. That ends the questioning for the NDP Caucus. Maybe we can get that in writing afterwards to you about that question. I'll turn it over now to Liberal Caucus and Mr. Wilson.
I certainly don't mind having him answer that question if that's possible.
Mr. Pickup?
Sure, and I'm not going to use a lot of your time because the answer is quick. It sounds like you're looking to some of the design phase type work, which really would be better suited to the department to ask them in terms of the design, why was it this broad?
Mr. Wilson?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, and I'd also want to thank you and your staff for this report. Just on my behalf, and I think all of my colleagues, it's been echoed a bit, that this is going to be taken very seriously by the government. We want to thank you and the Privacy Review Officer for the thoroughness in those two reports, and the recommendations are going to be followed up. I will touch on that a little later on. But to start with, you had mentioned that in your opening statements that this will only help repair, I think was the quote that you had, and only if work of recommendations are followed through will we see some fruit from this. Can you explain the importance of follow-up in this respect to this one report specifically?
Mr. Pickup.
Sure. So I since I'm asked the question, and Mr. Chair, I respect the member for asking me the question, so I will give the answer then. I do believe it's very important that the Public Accounts Committee follow up with the department on their action plan, on ensuring that it's being done on a timely basis. As I said earlier, we can't be everywhere every day following up everything, so we will come back in 2 years. You know, I believe that the commitment to us and through this audit is real. But let's say, for example, if there are challenges in implementing the recommendations, we will only know that really through follow-up. So follow-up is not just to make sure things are getting done, but it's also to understand the complexities that may be involved, the challenges that may be involved, the new risks that may be exposed in doing things. And I would also link in with that, since you asked, the question on the Amanda audit, for example. I mean, that one was done in 2016, similar issue to what we see here. And really there was no, you know, to put it fairly bluntly, I guess, there was no follow-up done outside of us. And as I said, our process that we can reasonably handle with the resources we have is a 2-year follow-up, so that'll be in March. So follow-up, I think, is critical. I will say, though, you know, just quickly that in fairness to the public service, to the people that we audit, I believe that when they commit to responding to the recommendations and to doing something, they believe it. But I do also believe that accountability, including the Public Accounts Committee, is an added element to encourage them. And you know, while it's often not reported, you know, probably the number one question I get at the Superstore or Costco is, you know, or people start with the assumption, well, you make all these recommendations and nobody ever does anything with them. And I tell people that's not true. You know, when we followed up in earlier 2018, 75% of the recommendations were implemented within 2 years. So I need to be hopeful, but I think hope has to just be a foundation over which follow-up occurs. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about the importance of follow-up.
You didn't have to link in that second part, because I was going to ask you specifically about the Amanda report also. And I was going to ask you a little later, but I'll go into it right now, seeing that we're there. You noted several times that that report that you tabled in this House did not have subsequent witnesses brought in after the fact to talk to that. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So we did that audit in fall of 2016, made a number of recommendations, including a couple of which parallel to this report. You know, I have to believe, as Auditor General, that it is important that when we do these audits and report to the House, that members of the legislature use those reports as a way to hold government accountable. That may be things like the Public Accounts Committee calling in the department as a witness. This is one of those audits. And I remember at the time when I was here talking about Amanda, you know, because I did talk about that in terms of my report day, of saying this is one of those areas that is important. It may not get a lot of public and media attention on that day because it is just some government system that does A, B, and C. And I think I recall even saying, you know, unless something happens, that's when you're going to hear about Amanda. But that doesn't diminish the need for follow-up, because we pick these audits to do areas that are important. And, you know, they're important and hopefully they work well. In this case, we see an example of something that didn't work so well. So I think follow-up would help, and we certainly wouldn't then be having the discussion today as to whatever happened with those recommendations from the Amanda audit, because probably, you know, we would all be aware of that already.
Do you know any specific recommendations that were in that report that could have impacted outcomes?
Sure. So there were now I do have to be fair. So there were recommendations in that Amanda audit that are similar to here, but we have to remember the timing. So that audit we produced in 2016, while we're reporting on this breach this week, a number of the things that were occurring on this were taking place at the same time. So whether or not, you know, how the timing would have lined up, probably would depend where and when the questions would have occurred. So I think I have to be fair on that and not opportunistic in saying, okay, you know, had you done everything in Amanda audit, maybe you wouldn't be in this, because the timing was a bit of an issue here when you look at the Appendix 2 timeframe.
So I guess you know what I'm getting at here. The importance of having all the Auditor General reports come before this House is significant. The importance of having witnesses subsequent to those chapters is significant, and the importance of follow-up for each and every one of those recommendations is significant for the future moving forward of our province. And I hope, I really do hope, that we as a committee, and I do believe we are moving in that direction, and I will assure you that on our side, I've heard it from my colleagues, but they never mentioned us when they said it, but I will guarantee you from our side, we will follow up and we will track those follow-ups, and I will give each and every one of you my commitment on that. That's key. I don't want to harp on that much more, but it is important to note that. It was a complicated read quickly yesterday and a busy day that we had, and to understand all of the underlying implications of a series of things that failed to protect this data. I am curious about one aspect of recommendation number 3 that was made, and you mentioned, I don't believe I've heard this asked, that about project management expertise, and how would the lack of expertise in that area contributed just in project management of the data breach?
Ms. White?
So it depends on which project you're sort of...
Well, the portal, say, for example. I think, okay. and am I wrong in saying that if the portal was secured, if there had been, you know, a real gatekeep key there, that this might not have happened? Is that too simplistic?
Ms. White?
So the portal project had a project manager who was experienced in project management, and actually is from the project management office of the province. She followed the procedures from a project management framework perspective that the province uses. The project sponsor should have been able to provide some more of the documents that were requested by the project manager throughout the process for the portal side of things.
Okay, that's helpful in understanding that. I do also, Mr. Pickup, enjoy the 5-6 questions that you always give us, and there's a couple I don't think, if I can squeeze them in quickly here, that didn't get asked also. So what role will the expert in-house group play in going forward in the assessment of the new IT systems or changes to the existing IT systems, in your estimation?
Mr. Pickup.
So we made the recommendation, as you allude to, in recommendation 2, that they should look to define the scope of responsibilities of that ARB. And in the response, the department said that they are currently reviewing the scope, mandate, and processes being performed, and they will determine what improvements and enhancements need to be done. So they, at the point of the audit, they weren't in the position to tell us what those exactly were going to be, that they were going to be working on these things. So perhaps in follow-up, they can then decide. Because to me, it's very much, you know, the difference between the auditor and management. It's not for the auditor to figure out what you want that ARB to do. It really is for management to say, here's what we want the ARB to do.
Thank you. And just quickly, what is the department doing now to ensure the safety and security of data that you know of at this moment?
So I think, you know, one of the big things that they did was recognizing back in April when this breach occurred that the threat assessment had to be done. right? So then they did that threat assessment working with the vendor, and they identified a number of vulnerabilities that had to be dealt with. So I think reacting quickly like that, you know, while I've certainly have said more than once that should have been done from the get-go, but I think then recognizing that they had a problem and they had to do something was a big first step at that time.
Okay, thank you. I believe I only have 2 minutes left here, so I am curious also that you, in your report, that you mentioned there were some problems with the tender contracts. Can you, I didn't hear any details. Do you have any details on what, or can you explain a little bit about what happened there with the tender contracts?
Ms. White?
So the software is proprietary and specific to this vendor. So in order to issue a tender for a new application, they would have to start all over again because there are no other vendors that could support the application that was coming forward. Does that make sense?
Is there another way you could explain it?
Okay, so the vendor that the contract is with,
yes,
outsourced the application to a subcontractor, but that subcontractor can't provide the services that the province needs to support the application overall. That's the main vendor that the province has a contract with. So no one else can sort of come in and take over for that.
Okay, is this a common problem with other large applications that we might have that you would know of?
That I don't know.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much. And if the Auditor General's office would like to have some final comments. Mr. Pickup.
So my final comments will be brief. One, I very much want to thank you for the questions today, and certainly, it certainly is one of the things that makes doing this job worthwhile and interesting, to see ultimately the people we report to, members of the legislature, interested in our work and engaged in our work. And I think I'm really pleased that this is a very clear example where everybody agrees, whether they're elected folks or whether they're us or the people in government, that this has to be fixed for the protection of all of Nova Scotians. We're all individuals. We all have a story. We all have families that have stories, and we expect that information to be held private where government has it. So it's in all of our interests to see these recommendations implemented. I also want to thank the people at the Department of Internal Services. This was a tough audit for them. There are some tough messages here, and yes, they didn't do the job that they should have done, but I respect that we can sit down with those folks and they can acknowledge that, and they can say, yeah, you know what, you got it right, we got to do better, and we can stand up and shake hands at the end of it and say, okay, we're all in this for the betterment of the people of Nova Scotia. Now let's move forward. So there's no time wasted in playing games and wasting energies. And for that, nobody ever reports that, but for that, I do have respect for the public servants and for the people who we deal with and who the team deals with, acknowledging to somebody's point earlier that these are people, and people who do, I think, ultimately want to do a good job. And then my final thanks would be, this was unusual for us to do an audit with another organization. So, my respect goes to the Privacy Commissioner and her folks as well. We ended it yesterday, but I think it was a very good process. We got to use our efficiencies. We got to use we looked at different things, and ultimately I think the day served Nova Scotians well in terms of getting the full story and full picture, and we're still talking at the end of it, so that's probably a good sign as well. So I will end on that, and thank you to the people in my office. And just one quick reminder, without sounding self-serving, is to remind you that this is our third report in 4 months. And for that, you know, I say thanks to the people in my office. We're only 35 people. And for the folks who those reports go through all of us, you know, that is a big accomplishment vis-a-vis other audit offices. So it's not me to thank, it's the 2 people with me and the 32, if I can do the math, the 32 other people who are across the street working on the March report. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We just have some short committee business to do. If you want to refer to the correspondence we've had sent back to us from the Nova Scotia Gaming Corporation, we have a response to the December 12, 2018 motion. Are there any comments or questions, concerns? Hearing none, we have also a letter from the Department of Community Services, Communities, Culture and Heritage on information requested from the January 9th meeting. Any comments or concerns about that? Does that letter answer the question that was posed of the grants? And I believe the cost of those grants, I think, might have been included in that question, but I'm not sure, but it wasn't. Okay, so we have adopted the endorsement of the Auditor General's report. The committee has adopted the practice of endorsing those recommendations. The Auditor General has now presented his January report to the committee today. Can I have a motion put forward to endorse those recommendations? Ms. Lonescroft.
Yes, Mr. Chair, and we thank the Auditor General and the Privacy Review Officer for their investigation and report. This was a very serious breach. Being said, I move that the Public Accounts Committee formally accept and endorse the recommendations contained in the January 2019 report of the Auditor General that have been accepted by the audited departments or agencies, and I ask those departments and agencies commit to and take responsibility for full and timely implementation of the recommendations accepted by those departments and agencies.
All those in favour of the motion? Contrary-minded? Motion is carried. Mr. Hallman.
I'd also like to put forward a motion that, along with endorsing the Auditor General's recommendations, this committee should also endorse the recommendations of the Privacy Commissioner.
Questions? All those in favour of the motion? Contrary-minded? Motion is carried. Thank you, Mr. Hallman. Being no further business, our next meeting will be on January the 30th, 2019, here in the chamber, when we have officials from the Nova Scotia Teachers Pension Plan, the Nova Scotia Health Employees Pension Plan, and the Public Service Superannuation Pension Plan about public sector pensions. The Chapter 3, October 2018 report of the Auditor General. Being no further business, I adjourn the meeting.